I was pretty young when this happened, 16 or 17. It was at my first job, which was just some trashy pizza place. They paid slightly more than other places, and I made extra from tips when I did deliveries, so I stayed there for a while. I don't remember much about the beginning of my shift that night. I probably started at my regular time, around 6 o'clock, and was scheduled until midnight. But the whole first half of my shift went by like any other day. It was sometime around 10 o'clock that we got an order for delivery, so I packed it up and left to drop it off. The place was 15 minutes away in a small neighborhood, and it took me a minute to find the house because all the trees were blocking the address numbers, and a lot of the homes had long driveways leading far from the road. Eventually, I did find it after circling back a few times. I drove down the driveway and parked closer to the home. It was one of those large houses that looked like it had been built forever ago. I got the food and walked up to the front porch. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was in this neighborhood. It felt like I was so far away from everything, especially with the trees everywhere. When I got up to the porch, though, the front door was wide open. I'd seen a lot of people leave their doors cracked open before, but the way this one was fully open was a little excessive. Anyway, I walked over and knelt down to set the food inside when a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in here? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, and he sounded friendly. I knew it was frowned upon to enter someone's home while delivering, but honestly, it was a fairly normal request. It usually didn't take more than a few extra seconds and typically secured a good tip. I stepped inside and walked down the hallway into the kitchen. I set the box on the table, but nobody else was in there. I had just heard his voice moments ago, and I never heard him walk anywhere else. I also noticed the house was extremely quiet, no other sounds at all. I felt a shiver run through me. As I decided to leave, his voice called out again, "Can you bring it in here, please?" His voice came from the other hallway connecting to the kitchen. There was a single door that was open, but whatever room was behind it was dark. There was no light on, and it also sounded like his voice came from right behind the doorway, like he was standing just out of sight. After a few seconds, I turned around and fast walked back out the front door. I got in my car and drove back to work, and I never said a word about it. I thought I'd either get made fun of for being scared or for being stupid, so I just kept it to myself. Thinking back on it now, though, there was definitely something off about that guy. Nothing about that encounter was normal. I'm just glad I was smart enough to leave when I did, because there's really no saying what would have happened if I went into that room with him. I was 20 and worked with my parents at a really small takeout restaurant. We specialized in to-go orders. I was in college at the time and had a very hectic schedule, but my parents were kind enough to offer me a laid-back position just as a general worker, usually working the to-go table or cleaning up the place after closing hours. This was during early December, and with finals coming up, I didn't have much time to work during the day, so I mostly took late-night shifts. One of the nights I was working, I noticed around an hour into my shift that a car was parked in the parking lot. The way our restaurant was laid out, it was a standalone shop with a tiny parking lot in front of it, so there was no crossover between other stores or businesses. I thought whoever parked there probably just didn't think anyone would care. And they were right, because I didn't really care. About 20 minutes later, they left. However, the next night, around the same time, the car pulled into the parking lot again. The first time was fine because I thought it was just a one-time thing, but coming back again was strange. I walked up to the front of the building and looked out. It was an older gray sedan with dark windows. They didn't seem to be trying to hide or anything, because they were facing right at the building and kept their headlights on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to cleaning. It was hard not to feel like they were watching me through the giant glass front windows, but just like last time, they left not too long after. After I finished up my work and clocked out an hour later, I walked to my car in the parking lot, feeling really uneasy. I knew they had left, but it was just concerning that the same car came by 2 nights in a row for seemingly no reason. I drove home and got some rest, having a lot of schoolwork to do. I decided to take off the next night, so I didn't return to work until the following night. The whole time I was inside cleaning, I had this anxious feeling, constantly looking out the windows expecting that car to come back at any point. But I never saw them pull in. I was inside for nearly 3 hours, finished everything I had to do, and not having seen the car, I felt like maybe it really was all nothing. I packed my stuff up and headed out, locking the door behind me. As I walked through the parking lot, that anxious and uneasy feeling rushed back to me. It felt like I suddenly got a burst of adrenaline, making me sweat and look in all directions. Then, as I was halfway across and standing out in the open, I spotted a car sitting in the far back of the parking lot, away from all the street lamps that lit up the area. Within seconds, it started moving quickly, driving toward me. I sprinted to my car, but I could hear their tires skidding on the pavement as they sped up right beside me and slammed on the brakes. I stumbled forward, thinking they were about to hit me. I was only a few feet away from my car, and suddenly the doors of their car swung open. I didn't even turn my head to look, keeping my focus completely on getting into my car. Footsteps rushed behind me, just as I opened my car and got in. Through the windows, I saw 3 men wearing masks and hoodies sprinting toward me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my car to turn on. The men started banging on the windows and trying to get the doors open, but I barely got it in drive and drove past them. I got out of the parking lot and onto the road, and from there, I was safe. I called 911 and pulled into a well-lit gas station nearby to wait for them. Unfortunately, the outside of our shop didn't have any cameras, so the police had minimal information to go on. I couldn't even see any of the men's faces. After that night, it's no surprise that I never saw the car or the men again. I used to work for a small startup company. I'm not even really sure what they did because I was just a security person, but I always thought it was a little strange that they even felt they needed a security guard. The office was really small and looked somewhat unimportant, like any other office. It made my job easy though, because I didn't have to parade around multiple floors all night. I got in at 9 o'clock and turned on the security alarm systems, then headed to the little security room that had all the camera screens set up. The place only had outdoor cameras, which were really low quality. The first couple of hours went by slowly with the usual nothing going on. Sometime around 1 a.m., though, I heard what sounded like a latch clicking shut. I sat there confused for a moment, then stood up and opened the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. There were only 3 doors down the hallway, and each one was closed. I walked over to each door, opening them and briefly looking around. The rooms were layered with a bunch of office desks, but from what I could see, it was all normal. By now, it had been long enough for me to start wondering if the sound I heard was actually what I thought it was. Maybe I just didn't hear it right. After all, the security system should have triggered an alarm if someone had opened one of the main doors to get inside. I went back to the room, leaving the door open to the hallway, so if I heard it again, it'd be more clear. I sat back down and continued monitoring the cameras. I checked the footage from the previous few minutes, just to see if I missed anything, but I didn't see anything at all. No movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed. By then, I'd pretty much come to terms with the idea that whatever I heard was nothing. I was back to not paying as much attention when a sound echoed down the hallway. It was faint, like a door opening slowly. I jumped up from my chair and walked into the hallway, not believing what I'd heard. I immediately saw one of the doors was cracked open. Knowing that none of the alarms had gone off and nothing had showed up on the cameras, I was extremely confused. I crept over and opened the door a little further, revealing the dark office room. I took a few steps inside, but didn't hear or see anything. So, I started to walk further in, going past each office desk. As I got to the back of the room, I saw the slightest movement on one of the walls, like a shadow or something. Before I could process it, I turned my head and instantly locked eyes with a person crouched underneath one of the desks. It was a man with black hair and large dark circles under his eyes. He had a look of both fear and anger, like he was both mad and worried that I'd found him. The instant we saw each other, though, he started getting up. I had no idea if he had any kind of weapons on him, so I took no chances and started running for my life. I went into the hallway and out the front doors, which triggered the security alarms and automatically notified the police. I went a safe distance away and then tried to watch the front doors as I waited for the officers to show up. It only took about 30 seconds before the door swung open and the man came running out. He ran around to the other side of the building, and from there I lost sight of him. When the officers got there, we downloaded the footage from the whole night, but nowhere in it did we see the man enter the building, so we don't know when or even how he got in. Obviously, the other question is why he broke in. After discussing it with the company, they said they knew nothing about it and didn't find anything missing. I have a hunch that they might have known more than they let on, though. Hiring security for their tiny office isn't normal unless you have a reason to. I think it might have actually been an old employee that they knew was a little unhinged. Anyway, I stayed there for another few months and then called it quits for a better job. I never found out anything else about what happened that night. This occurred over the winter break at our school. I worked part-time at the pizza place in our town the day after Christmas. It seemed like every student at my school worked here, and it was a rather well-known business. Since I was so young, I always consented to work whenever they needed me, since I felt wealthy after every paycheck. Since everyone would be spending the day at home with their family, I assumed it wouldn't be that busy. Nevertheless, I couldn't have been more mistaken. All of the indoor chairs were occupied by dinner time, and we were receiving a ton of delivery orders. It was my responsibility to welcome guests, seat them, and make deliveries as needed. I was instructed to begin accepting deliveries by my manager. After doing a fast one, I grabbed another from the kitchen and resumed my journey. One pizza was to be delivered to a house 20 minutes distant. The roads were actually lifeless, so at least they weren't crowded. There were hardly no people outside, which was a strange contrast to the busy pizza place. There was a light snowfall, scarcely discernible by the streetlights. Knowing what was waiting for me back at work, I tried to enjoy the tranquility by driving at the speed limit. I finally arrived at the client's home. It was right off the side of the road, with a lengthy gravel path going up to it, so it wasn't exactly in a neighborhood. There were extravagant Christmas decorations throughout the house and front yard, and the house itself was encircled by snow-covered trees. The fact that they hadn't plowed their driveway made it challenging to locate a spot to park without becoming stuck. After doing my best, I left with their order. As I approached their home, I observed that, from what I could see from the front of the house, every light inside was off, even though all of the lights and decorations outside were on. I noticed shoe prints in the snow leading up to the front as I got closer. Naturally, I assumed it was the owner. However, the shoe prints did not extend to the door when I reached the porch. They walked around to the porch's side. That struck me as strange, but I had no say in the matter. After 30 seconds, I knocked again because it was quite cold outside and I could still hear nothing coming from inside the house. I checked the receipt to make sure I needed the money, then knocked a third time because the shoe prints in the snow were new, so I knew they must be home. I got irritated and began to shiver, so I knocked one last time very loudly, probably shaking the entire house, but no one answered. Then I gave up trying. After leaving, I returned to my car, got in, and attempted to start it. However, the engine continued to stall and wouldn't start. I cursed quietly as I worked tirelessly to get it going, growing increasingly irritated as my hands grew colder and colder. Then, by chance, I looked up and noticed someone standing outside the home. They had everything zipped up, including snow pants, boots, and jackets. I exited my vehicle. "Hey, did you place your pizza order? I've spent the last 5 minutes outside your door knocking." They started to approach me without saying anything. After a few seconds of realizing something was off, I returned to my vehicle. I had the feeling that they knew I couldn't go because of the way they maintained their pace. no hustling or anything. I became anxious at that point. As they got closer to my window, I started to dial 911. The individual began talking just as the police inquired about the nature of my emergency. His voice was deep and low, and he kept asking whether I needed assistance. How could he possibly know that? That simply made my suspicions stronger. I explained to the officer how I got to my location and everything I could. The man outside became agitated, accelerating and scanning the area as if seeking a way in. Sitting helplessly in my small car with this probably deadly man outside and just a narrow window separating us was utterly horrifying. I prayed for it to work and kept attempting to start the engine. Then he began to search for anything in his pockets. When he was unable to locate what he was looking for, I could see the fear on his face. Then, as if he were going to fetch something, he ran back to the side of the house after punching the window many times in an attempt to smash it. I waited there for 2 minutes, unsure of whether to abandon my car and try to flee or wait for the police. Then I noticed the red and blue lights in my mirror blinking. The man appeared on the side of the house at the same moment, with something in his right hand. As soon as he spotted the lights, he took off. The events of that night probably don't require much explanation. The owners were away for the holidays, so that man didn't live there. To give the impression that they were at home, the man had plugged their decorations into the socket outside the house. He messed with anything outside my car to prevent it from starting while I was on the porch. To be honest, I didn't really comprehend it because I'm not a vehicle enthusiast. The man probably had plans to kidnap me, but he must have dropped his knife or whatever instrument he needed to shatter the window out of pure chance. He ran back to get it for that reason. Of course, there is no certainty, but that seems to be the most likely scenario. Anyway, after that I stopped making deliveries.